Back in the 1970s, Britain had some truly spectacular cars. 'Cause that looked powerful, elegant, and far more expensive than anything most ordinary families could park on their driveway. These were the cars people stopped to admire. The cars they dreamed about. And the cars many could only afford to read about in magazines. Some were built for speed. Some for luxury. And some simply had a presence that made everything around them look ordinary. So today, we're looking back at 10 British cars from the 1970s that everyone wanted, but few could afford. Number 10, Triumph Stag, 1970. When the Triumph Stag, 1970, arrived, it looked like the perfect British summer car. A long bonnet, elegant styling, a luxurious interior, and a V8 engine underneath. For many British motorists, the Stag represented freedom. Imagine driving along a country road. Roof down. Warm summer evening. That V8 soundtrack behind you. It looked every bit as glamorous as far more expensive European Grand Tourers. But for an ordinary family, buying one was a serious financial decision. There were children to feed, bills to pay, and houses to maintain. A two-door V8 sports tourer simply wasn't practical for most families. So many people admired the Stag, but ended up buying something much more sensible. Today, the Stag remains one of the most recognizable British cars of the 1970s. And for many enthusiasts, it still represents the dream of owning a proper British Grand Tourer. But the next car was even more dramatic, and its name became legendary among British performance car fans. Number 9, Lotus Esprit, 1976. When the Lotus Esprit, 1976 appeared, it looked like something from a different world. Low, sharp, and incredibly exotic. Most people seeing one for the first time wouldn't have guessed it was British. It looked like a supercar. And when it appeared on the big screen, its reputation became even bigger. But owning one was another matter. The Esprit was a serious performance machine, and its price put it firmly into dream car territory for most British families. It wasn't the sort of car you bought for the weekly shopping. It was the sort of car you saved pictures of, talked about with your friends, and hoped that one day you'd somehow be able to afford. For Britain's young car enthusiasts, the Esprit represented something special. It showed that Britain could build a sports car capable of standing alongside some of Europe's most exotic machinery. But the next car didn't need a supercar shape to turn heads, because it combined British luxury with enormous performance. Number 8, Jaguar XJ12, 1972. The Jaguar XJ12 in 1972 was the kind of car that instantly looked expensive, long, elegant, and powered by a magnificent V12 engine. Inside, there was leather, wood, and the kind of refinement associated with the world's most prestigious luxury cars. For many British motorists, a Jaguar was already a dream. But the XJ12 took that dream to another level. It offered effortless performance, remarkable smoothness, and a sense of occasion every time you opened the door. The problem was simple. It was expensive to buy, and expensive to run. A large V12 engine wasn't exactly designed for cheap motoring. Fuel bills alone could make an ordinary family think twice. So while people admired the XJ12, most were forced to settle for something smaller and cheaper. But that didn't stop the dream. For many British car enthusiasts, the sight of an XJ12 cruising down the road was enough to make them stop and stare. And 3 cars into our list, we've already reached some of Britain's greatest dream cars of the decade. But the next 7 are where things get really interesting. Number 7, Aston Martin V8, 1972. When the Aston Martin V8, 1972, arrived, it looked like the ultimate British muscle car. Long bonnet, wide stance, aggressive front end, and a huge V8 engine underneath. This wasn't a car for ordinary family motoring. It was built for people who wanted serious performance, combined with traditional British luxury. Inside, there was leather, wood, and an atmosphere that made every journey feel special. For British car enthusiasts, an Aston Martin V8 was almost impossible to ignore. But there was one major problem: the price. For most working families, it was completely out of reach. And even if someone somehow managed to buy one, fuel consumption and maintenance could make ownership frighteningly expensive. So the Aston remained a dream for most people. A car they admired from behind a showroom window, or spotted outside an expensive hotel. But the next car offered a very different kind of British performance, and it became one of the most recognizable sports cars of the entire decade. Number 6, TVR 3000M, 1972. The TVR 3000M, 1972, wasn't trying to be practical. It was built to excite. Low, wide, and unmistakably British. Underneath its distinctive bodywork was a powerful V6 engine, giving it the performance enthusiasts wanted. For young British drivers, a TVR represented something completely different from the family saloons filling Britain's roads. It was dramatic, it was unusual, and it felt genuinely special. But TVRs were never cheap cars, and they weren't exactly designed for the average family either. 2 seats, limited practicality, and expensive ownership meant that most people could only dream about having one. Still, that was part of the attraction. If you saw a TVR driving through your town, you remembered it. It wasn't another ordinary Ford or Austin. It was something rare, something exciting, something that looked like it belonged to another world. But the next British car took luxury and performance into even more serious territory. Number 5, Range Rover, 1970. When the Range Rover, 1970, arrived, it created an entirely new idea. Before it, a four-wheel drive vehicle was mostly something you bought for work. Farmers needed them. Military forces needed them. Off-road specialists needed them. But the Range Rover was different. It could cross difficult terrain. Yet inside, passengers could enjoy genuine comfort. There was space, a commanding driving position, and an unmistakable sense of luxury. For many British families, owning one seemed like the ultimate dream. You could take it across the countryside, drive it into town, and still arrive looking like you owned something very expensive. But the price was a major barrier. And running a large four-wheel drive vehicle wasn't cheap either. Fuel, maintenance, insurance, everything added up. So for most ordinary families, the Range Rover remained something to admire rather than own. But its influence was enormous. It proved that a vehicle could be both rugged and luxurious. And decades later, the entire luxury SUV industry would follow the path it created. But 5 cars are still waiting. And some of the most desirable British dream cars of the 1970s are still to come. Number 4, Jaguar XJS, 1975. When the Jaguar XJS, 1975, arrived, it looked like a car from the future. The long bonnet, the dramatic rear pillars, and the wide, low body gave it an unmistakable presence. But underneath that striking design was serious performance. The V12 engine delivered smooth, effortless power. Inside, there was leather, luxury, and the kind of refinement you'd expect from a much more expensive Grand Tourer. For many British motorists, the XJS was the car they dreamed about owning. But there was one obvious problem. It was expensive. Not just to buy, but to fuel, insure, and maintain. For an ordinary family, That could make ownership almost impossible. So the XJS became one of those cars people admired from a distance. A machine that represented success, even if it never made it onto their own driveway. But the next car had an even more famous badge. And for many British enthusiasts, it represented the ultimate dream of performance motoring. Number 3. Aston Martin Lagonda, 1976. The Aston Martin Lagonda, 1976, was unlike almost anything else on British roads. Its incredibly sharp shape, long body, and futuristic interior made it look decades ahead of its time. Inside, the designers went even further. Digital instruments, touch-sensitive controls, and an interior that looked like it belonged in a science fiction film. For wealthy buyers, it was a statement. For ordinary British motorists, it was pure fantasy. The price alone put the Lagonda far beyond the reach of most families. And its complicated technology made it even more intimidating. But that didn't stop people dreaming. For enthusiasts, the Lagonda represented the idea that Britain could build something completely different from the usual European luxury cars. It wasn't trying to copy anyone. It was trying to be the future. And that's why people still remember it today. But even the Lagonda wasn't the most desirable British car left on our list. Because number 2 combined luxury, performance and one of the most famous names in British motoring. Number 2, Rolls-Royce Corniche, 1971. The Rolls-Royce Corniche, 1971, was almost impossible for an ordinary British family to ignore. It looked expensive. Because it was. The elegant body, hand-finished interior, leather seats, an enormous sense of occasion made it one of Britain's ultimate luxury cars. For wealthy owners, it was the perfect grand tourer. For everyone else, it was the dream. Seeing one drive through a British town could make people stop and stare. You knew immediately that the owner had money. But many enthusiasts didn't necessarily dream about owning a brand new Corniche. They dreamed about one day finding an older example. Something that might eventually become affordable. Of course, running a Rolls-Royce was another matter entirely. Fuel, servicing, repairs, all could cost serious money. Still, the Corniche represented the ultimate fantasy of British luxury motoring. And for generations of car enthusiasts, it remained the sort of machine you could admire, even if you could never afford to park one at home. But there is still one car left. And number 1 may be the car that best captured the 1970s British dream. Number 1, Lotus Esprit Turbo, 1980. At number 1, we have a car that perfectly captured the dream of British performance motoring. The Lotus Esprit Turbo, 1980. By the beginning of the 1980s, the Esprit had evolved into something truly dramatic. Low, sharp, and unmistakably exotic. It looked like something that should have been wearing a much more expensive European badge. But this was British engineering. The turbo version added serious performance to an already stunning shape. For young British car enthusiasts, this was the sort of car you dreamed about while looking through motoring magazines. You didn't just want to drive one. You wanted to see one parked outside your house. But for an ordinary family, the price made that dream extremely difficult. There was also the cost of fuel, insurance, and maintenance. A Lotus Esprit wasn't a sensible family purchase. It was a reward, a dream. Something you bought when everything else in life had already been taken care of. And that's exactly why it became so desirable. The Esprit represented a world of speed, style, and success that most ordinary motorists could only imagine. Yet every time one appeared on a British road, people stopped and watched it disappear into the distance. It proved something important. Sometimes, a car doesn't need to be practical or affordable to become the car everyone dreams about. Sometimes, The dream itself is what makes the car unforgettable. The 1970s produced some of Britain's greatest dream cars. The Triumph Stag, the Jaguar XJ12, the Aston Martin V8, the Range Rover, and the incredible Lotus Esprit. Most ordinary families could never afford them when they were new. But that didn't stop people dreaming. They appeared in magazines, on television, outside expensive hotels, and occasionally on the road right in front of you. For many British enthusiasts, those few seconds were enough to stay in their memory for decades. Because these weren't just cars. They represented success, freedom, performance, and the hope that one day you might finally own your dream car. Which one would you have wanted sitting on your driveway? Let us know in the comments. And subscribe to UK Talk for more British automotive history.